For more on today's top political stories, let's bring in Olivia Gazis and Nicholas Wu. Olivia is a CBS intelligence and national security reporter. Nicholas covers Congress for Politico. Hello to you both. Olivia, let's start with you. In this White House speech today, President Biden announced further sanctions on Russia. Let's take a listen.
I've told Putin to his face more than a month ago that we would act together. And the moment Russia moved against Ukraine, Russia has now undeniably moved against Ukraine by declaring these independent states. So today, I'm announcing the first tranche of sanctions to impose costs on Russia in response to their actions.
So, Olivia, do your intelligence sources think that this first tranche of sanctions is going to be enough to deter Putin?
Sure. It's a very good question, Nancy. And there's essentially three parts to the sanctions that the president announced today. The first targets two very large Russian banks, VEB Bank, which officials describe essentially as a piggy bank for the Kremlin and holds about $50 billion in assets. And the other is a bank that finances the Russian military and holds assets of about $30 billion. They're not Russia's biggest or most influential banks, but they are very closely tied to the government, which is perhaps why they're serving as a starting point. The second part of this package targets Russia's sovereign debt so that it can't raise money or trade any new debt in U.S. and European markets, which combined are massive. And ultimately, over time, that means higher borrowing costs and lower overall growth for Moscow. Third, they're sanctioning a group of Russian elites and their family members who happen to be close to Vladimir Putin. And all of this is in addition to perhaps that most significant step of all right now, shutting down the Nord Stream 2 pipeline with Germany, which would have generated billions of dollars in oil revenues for Russia, and Putin can't be entirely happy about. Overall, I would say they are not the most painful measures imaginable. But as you've heard, the administration has been stressing this is the beginning of an invasion, so these are the beginning of the West's response. If Putin escalates further, so will the U.S., so will the West. And by the way, I think you heard officials say today, sanctioning Putin himself is still not off the table. So there's more to be done.
Well, Nicholas, what are you hearing from lawmakers? Where does congressional support stand for the president's sanctions?
It's been kind of across the board, depending on the party that you talk to. Democrats have largely been supportive of the president's actions here. And then there's been some nuance to Republicans' response here. Some are outright bashing Biden. Senator Ted Cruz said that Biden helped cause this in some ways by not being tough enough on Putin, while others have called for stricter measures. Still others have taken more of a wait-and-see approach. But what remains to be seen here is whether or not the administration will ask Congress for anything related to this whole crisis, whether that requires new legislation or any other congressional support that's needed in this instance.
Well, Olivia, the president continues to express hope for diplomacy, but also seems somewhat resigned to conflict. What is actually happening on the diplomatic front?
You're right. The president seemed to make a point of concluding his remarks today by saying that the U.S. and its partners remain open to diplomacy, even apparently personally adding, I'm hoping diplomacy is still available. It's not at all clear where or between who that might happen at this point. The possibility of a presidential meeting seemed to evaporate yesterday with Putin's announcement on Donetsk and Luhansk. And we just learned a little while ago that Secretary of State Blinken has also scrapped what had been a potential meeting this week with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, saying it doesn't make sense to move forward with that meeting at this time. Throughout this crisis, both the administration and NATO have been saying that they value diplomacy, they urge Russia to pursue the path of diplomacy, but at the same time that they're preparing for a variety of scenarios, including military conflict, which is, I think, why you also heard the president today say that he had authorized the movement of U.S. troops and equipment to bolster the defenses of the Baltic states, in particular, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, because they would arguably be the most exposed in the event that this conflict spilled over beyond Ukraine.
Nicholas, President Biden is now facing pressure from some Republicans and Democrats to go ahead and just dump all the sanctions on Russia now, fully cut them off from Western investment. We heard it from Mitch McConnell. We heard it from Bob Menendez. How universal is that view on Capitol Hill?
It's kind of divided. I mean, the administration's been pretty clear so far that they want to hold some of these tougher measures in reserve in the event that Russia does go further here, and so that the administration will maintain other options to respond to any further Russian aggression in Ukraine. And so, we've had members of Congress that have recently returned from trips related to the Ukraine crisis, and the consensus here seems to be that there's a little bit of a wait and see approach, looking to see what Russia does more here, while at the same time, yes, there are some who are calling for stricter measures, but so far, legislation has not really advanced that would do so.
And then, Olivia, the Biden administration has taken this somewhat unusual strategy in this conflict. They've been publicly sharing some of their intelligence in order to signpost what they think the Russians are going to do next. What's the thinking behind that strategy, and do your sources believe that it's working?
Another really great question, Nancy. I think you're absolutely right that, it's been remarkable, the level and the pace of declassification and public disclosure of intelligence by the U.S. and other allies. It's really been unprecedented, and some of it appears to have been in close to real time. In part, that's just a function of our times, right? The world is so interconnected. There's so much out in the open on social media, coming in via commercial satellites, that you don't necessarily need an intelligence agency to inform you of things like troop movements or the construction of field hospital and things like that. They're just visible. But to your point, there have also been these details that have been no doubt obtained by human sources, signals and intercepts, which would be classified, and that the government has opted to declassify and share with the world, essentially saying, hey, here's what we're seeing Russia might be planning. And that's been in an effort to sort of ignore the public, prepare them for the potential lies and distortions that we know the Russian government can be capable of. And I think you have seen some payoff in terms of a growing skepticism among the public for, for example, Russian claims of violence being instigated by Ukraine when in fact it's the other way around, or it's a false flag operation. What my sources question, and I think it does remain a very valid open question, is whether these disclosures have had any sort of meaningful deterrent effect, because it appears in many cases Russia has just brazenly forged ahead with a lot of what has been forecast, which includes the invasion that we're seeing unfolding now.
Nicholas, I want to turn to another issue for a moment. The Supreme Court rejected the latest of several attempts by former President Trump to keep documents related to January 6th secret. What does that mean for the future of the investigation?
Well, this was not an unexpected decision by the Supreme Court. They already ruled some time ago to let the lower court ruling on these documents stand. But this continues to unlock more and more documents for the committee, and more pages of records. And in particular, in this whole tranche of documents are records related to Congressman Louis Gohmert's lawsuit against Vice President Pence, trying to get him to overturn the election. So, what we could see here, if these records do ever end up seeing the light of day, is more color and context to a lot of these previously reported events, and perhaps even things that we don't know about that we will find out about as this is disclosed to the public.
All right, Olivia Gazis and Nicholas Wu, thank you both. We appreciate your insight.